A woman in a soaked floral sundress stood before a locked mansion gate, her blonde hair plastered to her face by the freezing rain. One hand clutched a heavy black bag of clothes, the only remains of a life she once thought was hers. The other hand pressed against her stomach, a desperate, instinctive gesture for a child she had just lost. Behind her, the iron gate clicked shut with a finality that echoed louder than the thunder. Inside the house, through the rain-streaked window, a man laughed as he raised a glass to a dark-haired woman. The warm glow of the chandelier caught the amber liquid in their crystal glasses. Music drifted through the cracks of the heavy doors. For them, the evening was a celebration. For Zinnia Lloyds, everything had ended. A sharp, hot pain flared in her abdomen, and as she looked down, she saw a trail of crimson mixing with the rainwater, streaming down her pale, bare leg. She let out a breath that was more of a broken sob, a sound so hollow it could shatter the hardest heart. She looked back at the window one last time, not for the man, but for the life she had tried so hard to protect. Then, Zinnia turned away. She turned away from the mansion, away from the cruelty of Alex, and away from the woman who had taken her place. She stepped into the darkness of the storm, her bare feet hitting the cold, wet pavement. She did not look back. Her name was Zinnia, and she was about to discover that the storm which had just stripped her of everything was the same storm that would lead her to the only man capable of burning the world down to get her justice. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. This is her story. It was not always a nightmare of rain and blood. There was a time when Zinnia knew a different kind of warmth. Not the cold, expensive luxury of a mansion in the hills, but a simple, glowing happiness. The kind that lives in quiet mornings and shared dreams. She had once been the most cherished woman in a small apartment on the edge of the city. Alex had found her at a gallery opening when she was 22. She was standing by a painting of a wilting rose, wearing a simple dress and trying to blend into the shadows. He had crossed the room just to hear her voice. He was charming then, full of ambition and a hunger to conquer the corporate world. Zinnia had believed in him completely, never realizing that his hunger would eventually grow large enough to swallow her whole. Zinnia's fingers were white from the effort of gripping her bag, the plastic handles cutting into her palms as she retreated from the mansion. Every step she took away from the iron gates felt like pulling a limb through heavy, freezing mud. The rain was no longer just water, it felt like a physical weight, a liquid shroud attempting to pull her down into the asphalt. She didn't know where she was going. In this neighborhood of sprawling estates and high walls, there were no bus stops, no shelters, and certainly no mercy for a woman who looked like a ghost. A sharp, jagged cramp tore through her lower abdomen, forcing her to double over. She leaned her shoulder against a cold stone perimeter wall, her breath coming in ragged, hitching gasps. The physical pain of the miscarriage was a cruel mirror to the hollow ache in her chest. It was a silent, private mourning, washed away by the storm before she even had the chance to name what she had lost. Alex had called her useless when the doctor gave them the news, his voice devoid of anything resembling grief. He hadn't seen a tragedy, he had seen a broken contract. She looked down at her feet. Her skin was blue-tinged and wrinkled from the wet, her toenails chipped and bleeding from the rough pavement. The floral pattern of her dress, once bright and cheerful, was now a dark, sodden mess that clung to her shivering frame. She forced herself to move again, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She thought of Miranda's laughter echoing through the foyer, the woman who had been wearing Zinnia's silk robe when Alex threw the bag of clothes at Zinnia's feet. The injustice of it felt like a different kind of poison, one that burned hotter than the fever beginning to take hold of her. She had given Alex everything, her inheritance, her youth, her unwavering loyalty, and he had discarded her like refuse on a curb. The streetlights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock her. She was alone, bleeding, and invisible to the world. As her vision began to blur with the combined assault of tears and rain, she wondered if she would simply disappear into the storm, a forgotten footnote in the life of a man who never deserved her. The roar of the rain was suddenly joined by the low, predatory hum of an engine. Through the haze of her exhaustion, Zinnia saw two piercing white orbs of light cut through the dark, reflecting off the flooded asphalt like twin moons. A matte black SUV, massive and imposing, slowed to a crawl beside her. Zinnia frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. In this part of the city, a car stopping usually meant trouble, and she was in no condition to run. The vehicle came to a complete halt, its heavy tires displacing a wave of water that soaked her ankles. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. The engine purred, a dark beast idling in the shadows. Then, the heavy thud of a door closing echoed through the street. A man stepped out, and even through the sheets of rain, his presence was staggering. He was tall, dressed in a dark overcoat that hung over his shoulders like a cape, and despite the downpour, he didn't move with the frantic energy of someone trying to stay dry. He moved with a calculated, lethal grace. Killian Alpha stood by the door of the SUV, his dark hair slicked back, his expression unreadable as he watched the woman shivering on the curb. He didn't see a beggar or a victim, he saw a blonde girl in a ruined dress who looked like she had just crawled out of a war zone. His eyes traveled from her bare, blood-stained feet to the way she clutched that black bag as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that managed to pierce through the sound of the thunder. It wasn't a question, it was an observation made with the precision of a man used to assessing damage. Zinnia tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was filled with glass. She looked up at him, her vision swaying. In the dim light of the street lamp, his face looked like it was carved from granite, guarded, alert, and terrifyingly handsome. She should have been afraid of him, but as her knees finally gave way and the world began to tilt, she realized that the shadow he cast was the only thing protecting her from the storm. As she fell, the last thing she felt wasn't the cold pavement, but a pair of strong, steady arms catching her before she hit the ground. The interior of the SUV was a stark contrast to the world Zinnia had just left. It smelled of expensive cedarwood, cold rain, and the faint, metallic tang of power. Killian didn't hesitate as he lifted Zinnia's limp body onto the hand-stitched Italian leather of the rear seat. He didn't care that her soaked dress immediately darkened the cream-colored hide or that the thick, crimson smear from her leg began to seep into the intricate seams of the upholstery. To a man like Killian Alpha, everything had a price, and everything was replaceable, except, perhaps, the flickering spark of life in the woman now shivering in his shadow. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a controlled fury that matched his own. "Sammy, have the medical wing ready." Now, he barked into his hands-free system, his voice devoid of its usual clinical detachment. He glanced into the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing as he watched Zinnia's head loll against the headrest. She looked so small against the vastness of the car, a broken bird caught in the middle of a hurricane. As he tore through the flooded streets, weaving through traffic with a lethal disregard for safety, Zinnia let out a soft, pained moan. Her hand moved weakly, searching for the bag she had dropped on the floor mats. Killian reached back, his large hand briefly brushing her frozen fingers as he tucked the bag securely against her side. It was a small gesture, one he didn't quite understand himself. He was a man who dealt in debts and silhouettes, a man whose heart was rumored to be made of the same matte black steel as his car. Yet, seeing the way she clung to her meager belongings, the discarded scraps of a life Alex had deemed worthless, stirred a protective instinct he had buried years ago. The blood continued to pool on the expensive leather, a permanent stain on his pristine world, but Killian didn't look away. He drove faster, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He had spent his life watching people take what they wanted and discard the rest. He recognized the work of a predator when he saw it, and looking at Zinnia, he knew she had been hunted. He wasn't a savior, but as he pulled through the heavy reinforced gates of his private estate, he knew one thing for certain: the man who had done this to her had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. The first thing Zinnia felt was the scent of lavender and expensive linen, a sharp departure from the metallic tang of the rain. She moved her hand, expecting to feel the cold, abrasive asphalt of the street, but instead, her fingers brushed against a heavy down comforter. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the soft, amber glow of a bedside lamp. The room was vast, filled with shadows and high-end mahogany furniture that felt more like a fortress than a bedroom. This was the Alpha Stronghold, a place of quiet power and absolute silence. A soft rustle came from the corner of the room, and an older woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun stepped into the light. She wore a simple charcoal dress and moved with a grace that suggested she had spent decades managing the chaos of this house. This was Alara, the heartbeat of the estate. When she saw Zinnia was awake, she didn't rush over with frantic questions. Instead, she approached with a small, knowing smile and a bowl of steaming broth. "You're safe now, child," Alara whispered, her voice like velvet. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed a cool hand on Zinnia's forehead, checking for the fever that had nearly claimed her in the storm. The touch was devoid of the transactional coldness Zinnia had grown used to with Alex. It was a mother's touch, unconditional and steady. For the first time in years, Zinnia didn't feel like a piece of property or a disappointment, she felt seen. Alara helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back with practiced ease. As Zinnia took her first sip of the broth, the warmth spread through her chest, thawing the ice that had settled around her heart. Alara didn't ask about the blood on the SUV's leather or why a woman in a floral dress had been left to die. She simply watched over her, a silent guardian in the sanctuary of the night. Zinnia looked toward the heavy oak door, wondering where the man with the granite face had gone, but as Alara tucked the blankets tighter around her, she realized that for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't something to fear. It was a shield. In this room, the storm couldn't reach her, and the man who had discarded her was worlds away. The days that followed were a blur of soft textures and quiet gestures. Zinnia remained in the safety of the guest wing, her body slowly knitting itself back together, though her mind still drifted to the cold rain and the slammed gate. She expected to be treated like a burden or an intruder, yet the house seemed to anticipate her needs before she could even voice them. Each morning, a fresh set of clothes appeared on the velvet armchair, not the restrictive, trophy wife dresses Alex had forced her to wear, but soft cashmere sweaters and muted creams and silk trousers that felt like a second skin. They were high-end, anonymous, and perfect fits. It wasn't until the third evening that she noticed the most significant change. In the corner of her sitting room, beneath the wide window that looked out over the estate's manicured gardens, stood a professional-grade mahogany easel. Beside it was a tray stocked with high-quality oil paints, a set of fine bristled brushes, and several blank canvases. Zinnia stood before it, her fingers trembling as she touched the tubes of pigment. She hadn't painted in years. Alex had called her hobby a messy waste of time, and had converted her home studio into a cigar room shortly after their wedding. He had never looked at her hands and seen an artist, he had only seen a hostess. But Killian, a man she had barely spoken 10 words to, had noticed. He had seen the faint, old stains of cadmium red beneath her fingernails that night in the car, or perhaps he had seen the way her eyes lingered on the artwork in his hallways. He didn't come to her to claim credit. He didn't demand a thank you. He simply provided, his presence felt in the lack of noise and the abundance of choice. When Zinnia finally picked up a brush, the first stroke she made wasn't a wilting rose, but a sharp, bold line of sapphire blue, the color of the sky just before a storm breaks. For the first time, she wasn't painting to please a critic, she was painting to find herself. Killian Alpha was a man of shadows and secrets, but in the quiet gift of the paints, he had given Zinnia the one thing Alex had spent years trying to destroy, her own color. The scent of fresh oil paint usually brought Zinnia a sense of peace, but today the air in the guest wing felt heavy, charged with a tension she couldn't name. The mahogany door creaked open, and for the first time, it wasn't Alara with a tray of tea. Instead, Sammy, the man who had been the shadow behind Killian's steering wheel, entered alongside a younger man with sharp, analytical eyes named Dominic. Between them, they held a thin manila folder, a small object that seemed to carry the weight of a lead casket. Dominic didn't offer a greeting. He was a man of data and cold facts, much like the master of the house. He laid several sheets of paper onto the small table beside Zinnia's easel, the clinical whiteness of the reports clashing with the vibrant sapphire blue on her canvas. "We ran a full panel on the blood samples taken the night you arrived," Dominic began, his voice devoid of emotion but not of gravity. "And we cross-referenced them with the vitamin supplements your husband insisted you take throughout your pregnancy." Zinnia felt a chill move up her spine, a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain outside. She remembered those pills. Alex had been so attentive, so insistent that she never miss a dose, claiming they were for the baby's strength. Dominic pointed to a highlighted row of chemical compounds. "This isn't a vitamin deficiency, Zinnia. It's a sophisticated, slow-acting toxin. It's designed to mimic the symptoms of a natural decline, fatigue, dizziness, and eventually, the termination of a pregnancy." The world seemed to tilt. The accident, the sudden loss that had broken her heart and given Alex the excuse to cast her out, had been a calculated execution. "He didn't just want you gone," Sammy added, his voice a low growl of protective fury. "He wanted to ensure you left with nothing. No heir, no claim, and no strength to fight back. He was poisoning the very life you were carrying to clear the way for his mistress and your estate." Zinnia stared at the report, the medical jargon blurring through a sudden veil of tears. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a cold-blooded murder of a future they were supposed to share. The silence of the Alpha stronghold was no longer just a shield, it was a gathering storm. As the truth settled into her bones, the grief that had nearly drowned her transformed into something sharp, bright, and dangerous. Alex hadn't just thrown her into the rain, he had tried to erase her. But looking at the evidence in her hands, Zinnia realized he had made one fatal error. He had left her alive, and he had left her in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a monster. The heavy iron gates of the Alpha estate groaned as they slid open, but not for the matte black SUV. Instead, a silver Mercedes, sleek, pretentious, and painfully familiar, idled in the driveway. Alex stepped out, looking every bit the grieving husband in a tailored suit, though his eyes darted around the fortress-like grounds with a mixture of greed and unease. He had spent a week assuming Zinnia had crawled into a gutter to die. Finding out she was being harbored in the most powerful estate in the city had changed his strategy from disposal to reclamation. Zinnia stood on the wide stone portico, her hands resting at her sides. She wasn't wearing the floral sundress of a victim anymore. She wore a structured, ivory wool coat that Alara had prepared for her, its high collar framing a face that had lost its softness and gained something much more dangerous. Behind her, invisible but felt, stood Killian. He didn't need to speak, His presence was a silent promise of violence held in check only by Zinnia's command. "Zinnia, darling," Alex called out, flashing the practiced, dimpled smile that had once been her entire world. He took a step forward, his voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern. "I've been frantic. The miscarriage, it unhinged me. I said things I didn't mean. Come home now. Let's put this ugly nightmare behind us." Zinnia watched him, her gaze as cold and steady as the rain that had nearly claimed her. For years, she would have crumbled at that tone, apologizing for his cruelty. Now, she only saw the wolf at the gate, his teeth bared in a mimicry of love. "The only nightmare, Alex, was the one you fed me in small white pills," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was low, resonant, and carried across the driveway with the weight of an executioner's blade. Alex froze, the smile faltering as his eyes flickered toward Killian. "I am not your darling, and I am certainly not your property to fetch. You didn't come here for me. You came here because you're afraid of what I've become in the dark." She took a single step toward the edge of the stairs, looking down at the man who had tried to erase her. "Go back to your mansion and your mistress. Enjoy the silence while it lasts. Because the next time we meet, I won't be the woman standing in the rain. I'll be the one bringing the storm." Without waiting for his response, she turned her back on him, a gesture of pure, liberated indifference. As she walked back into the warmth of the stronghold, the heavy oak doors thudded shut, leaving Alex alone in the shadows of a power he could never hope to understand. The grand ballroom of the Intercontinental was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, but the air felt thin, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Alex stood at the center of a small circle of investors, his arm draped possessively around Miranda, who preened in a dress that cost more than Zinnia's former yearly allowance. He was laughing, the sound of a man who believed he had successfully buried his secrets beneath a foundation of lies. He didn't see the heavy oak doors swing open. He didn't see the room go silent. Zinnia entered not as a guest, but as a reckoning. She was draped in a floor-length gown of midnight velvet that seemed to swallow the light of the chandeliers. Beside her, Killian Alpha moved like a storm cloud made flesh, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of both protection and partnership. The crowd parted like a receding tide. When Alex's eyes finally met Zinnia's, his glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. "You shouldn't be here," Alex stammered, his face draining of color as the grieving husband mask cracked. Zinnia didn't falter. She stepped into the light of the center stage, where a large projector screen usually displayed corporate growth. With a subtle nod from Killian, the screen flickered to life. It wasn't marketing data. It was the toxicology report, the medical records from the night of her eviction, and a series of recorded wire transfers from Alex's private account to a black market pharmaceutical dealer. The murmurs of the elite rose like a swarm of hornets. "I'm not here to stay, Alex," Zinnia said, her voice amplified by the sudden, dead silence of the hall. "I'm here to return what belongs to you." As she spoke, blue-uniformed officers stepped from the shadows of the velvet curtains. Dominic followed them, handing a folder of sworn affidavits to the lead investigator. Alex reached for Miranda, but she stepped away, her eyes wide with the realization that the ship was sinking. The social execution was instantaneous, the legal one was beginning. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Zinnia didn't feel the surge of hatred she expected. She felt only a profound, quiet lightness. She looked at Killian, who watched her with a rare, private ghost of a smile. The justice wasn't in the arrest, it was in the fact that she could finally breathe without the scent of poison in the air. A year later, the rain fell over the city once more, but this time, Zinnia did not shiver. She stood behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of the newly inaugurated Lloyd's Alpha Center, watching the droplets race down the pane. The building, a converted estate on the edge of the city, served as a sanctuary for women who had been discarded, poisoned by the words and actions of men who thought they were disposable. It was a place of medical healing and legal warfare, a dove house born from the wreckage of her own life. Zinnia watched as a woman at the gate was welcomed inside, not with a slammed door, but with a warm coat and a promise of safety. Killian appeared at her side, his presence as steady and silent as it had been the night he found her on the pavement. He didn't stand behind her like a master, nor in front of her like a shield, he stood beside her. The world whispered that she was the Mafia Queen, a title given to the woman who had tamed the city's most dangerous man. But Zinnia knew the truth was much simpler. They were two survivors who had recognized the same fire in each other's eyes, the kind of fire that only grows after a storm tries to put it out. "The Foundation's first wing is full," she said softly, her hand finding his. Her fingers were no longer stained with the pale marks of illness, but with the bold, vibrant oils of her latest canvas. Killian squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the gold band on her finger. "You gave them a choice, Zinnia," he replied, his voice a low rumble of pride. "That is more powerful than any weapon I possess." As they looked out over the city together, Zinnia realized that the storm hadn't just been a tragedy, it had been a clearing. It had washed away the small woman she used to be to make room for the leader she had become. She wasn't standing with Killian because of a debt or a rescue. She was there because she had walked through the rain and discovered that she was the one who controlled the thunder. Her story was no longer one of survival, but of legacy. And as the sun began to break through the clouds, Zinnia Lloyds finally understood that the most beautiful colors are the ones we paint for ourselves. The final chapter of our story is not one written on a page, but one that lives in the choices we make every day. Zinnia's journey from the freezing rain to the mahogany halls of the Alpha Estate is a reminder that the world can be incredibly cruel, but it is also full of unexpected sanctuaries. When we look at Zinnia's story, we see a woman who was made small by a man who was supposed to protect her. Alex didn't just take her home, he tried to take her sense of self, her health, and her future. If you were standing at that gate, watching the man you loved toast to your ruin while you stood bleeding in the rain, what would have been your first thought? Would you have felt the urge to give up, or would that first spark of cold fury have ignited in you too? Stories like this serve as a mirror. They ask us to look at the Alexes in our own lives, the people or situations that poison our potential slowly, one vitamin at a time. They also ask us to recognize the Killians, the unexpected allies who don't necessarily offer a soft landing, but offer the tools and the silence we need to rebuild ourselves. So, I want to ask you. If you were Zinnia, could you have trusted a man like Killian Alpha, a man of shadows, after being betrayed by a man of light like Alex? Was the public exposure at the gala enough? If you were the Queen of the Storm, would you have sought a more personal revenge, or is living well and helping others truly the best way to get back at those who hurt us? Zinnia's strength didn't come from Killian's money, it came from the moment she stopped looking back at the gate and started walking into the storm. What is the gate in your life that you need to stop looking back at? In the comments below, tell us your storm story. Have you ever had a moment where losing everything was actually the beginning of finding yourself? We are a community of survivors, and like Zinnia, your voice has more power than you know. Remember, the rain might be cold, but it's also what makes the flowers grow. Thank you for walking through the storm with Zinnia and Killian. Your support helps us tell more stories of justice, transformation, and the strength of the human spirit. Until next time, keep your head high and your colors bright.